They called it a funeral. But the ground of ancient Rome was soaked in blood long before the body was ever lowered into the earth. In the choking summer heat, nobles in white togas gathered in a circle, incense curling like ghostly snakes around their heads, as two slaves were led into the pit. They were forced to fight with crude swords, their ankles chained together so they could not flee. The crowd whispered prayers to Jupiter and Mars. When one slave's skull split open with a wet crack, and his blood seeped into the soil, the nobles nodded in satisfaction. The spirit of the dead man would be pleased. This was how it began, not in grand arenas or marble temples, but in shallow graves under the shadow of funeral pyres. To the Romans, blood was not just life, it was currency, and the dead demanded payment. The ritual was called the munus, meaning duty or offering. Families of the elite believed that shedding human blood at a noble's funeral could appease restless spirits. The dead, they said, were hungry. Their shades wandered the underworld until fed with life, and so they fed the men. At first, it was two captives, chosen for their strength and desperation. They were armed, forced to kill each other, while mourners watched with solemn reverence. It was never called entertainment. It was sacrifice. But something shifted in those early days. The crowd began to cheer. A flash of steel, a spurt of blood, and they felt something awaken in their chests, something ancient and savage. Priests told them it was the favor of the gods, but the Romans knew deep down it was something darker. They were tasting power. Over decades, the munus changed. The chains were removed, the fighters trained, the pits grew larger, wooden stands rose around the graves. Wealthy patrons began to sponsor the fights, seeing them not as sacred duties, but as displays of status and prestige. Senators competed to host the bloodiest funerals. People no longer came to mourn the dead, they came to see death. What had begun as whispered rites became public spectacle. The games consumed the city like a fever. In the smoky air of the early arenas, the line between man and beast blurred. The fighters were slaves, prisoners of war, criminals branded on their foreheads, stripped of names and called only damnati, the condemned. But as they killed, something strange happened. The crowd began to worship them. They called them gladiators, from the gladius, the short Roman sword. The word meant swordsman, but to the masses it meant something more, a chosen vessel of death, half man, half God. Gladiators bled for the dead, but they lived in the minds of the living like demigods of the underworld. Rumors spread that the gods themselves chose who lived or died on the sand. When a fighter fell, his blood was collected in bowls and given to mourners to drink. It was said to carry strength, courage, even visions. Mothers whispered it could cure epilepsy. Men anointed their foreheads with it before battle. In dark corners of Rome, secret cults began to form, tiny circles of fanatics who prayed to the spirits of dead gladiators, believing their souls lingered in the blood-soaked sands of the arena. These were not drunken gamblers. They were patricians, senators, even priests. They saw the arena as a gate to the afterlife, and the gladiator's death as a bridge between worlds. The arenas themselves began to reflect this belief. Early wooden amphitheaters were designed not just as venues, but as temples. Altars stood at the entrances, where priests slaughtered bulls before the games. The arena floor was sprinkled with sacred ash. Before each match, a priest would walk the sand barefoot, chanting to Dispata, god of the underworld, to open the veil between life and death. When the first trumpet sounded, the crowd fell silent, not out of respect, but fear. They believed the underworld was watching, and the fighters knew it. To die in the arena was terror, but to die well, to face the blade without flinching, was to become immortal. Names of fallen gladiators were etched into stone tablets and carried in procession through the streets. Their masks were hung on household shrines. Children wore amulets carved in their likeness. The cult of blood was growing. It infected every level of society. Even emperors felt its pull. Julius Caesar, seeking the people's love, staged vast funeral games for his father with hundreds of gladiators. The stands overflowed. Blood splashed on the marble steps. Men tore at their clothes, screaming the fighters' names like prayers. Rome was no longer mourning the dead. It was worshiping death itself. By the end of the Republic, the games were no longer funerals at all. They were festivals of slaughter, funded by the state, celebrated like holy days. Priests still muttered that the blood honored the dead, but everyone knew the truth. The blood was for the living, for the roaring mob that craved the smell of iron and fear, for the senators who measured their glory in corpses, for the city that had built its empire on conquest and needed an altar to its own violence. The munus had become something monstrous. The cult of blood was no longer hidden. It stood in the sunlight. It smiled from the marble steps of the Forum Romanum, and it was hungry. The Romans had opened a door that could never be closed again, and beyond that door, waiting in the dark, was something older than gods, something that had been sleeping in the hearts of men since the first stone blade cut the first throat. The crowd called it glory. The priests called it piety. But the fighters knew its true name, death, and they knew it would never stop asking for more. The city believed it was merely watching blood, but in truth it was being baptized in it. And soon ancient Rome would build something vast and terrible, a monument where this cult could reign forever, a place where death would wear a crown of laurel and sit upon a golden throne, a place called the Colosseum. They called it training, but it was closer to breaking. Inside the stone walls of Ludus Magnus, just steps from the roaring heart of ancient Rome, men were stripped of their pasts and rebuilt into living weapons. Prisoners, slaves, and even desperate volunteers were marched through the gates and branded like cattle. Their names vanished. They became property of the arena. Dawn began with chains clanking open. They ran in full armor until their legs collapsed. They slammed wooden swords into posts until their palms split and bled. Doctores, scarred former champions, lashed their backs for hesitation and bellowed that pain was proof of life. They learned to fall without shattering bones, to bleed without fear, and to never, ever beg. At night, they lay chained in straw, listening to the screams of the day's losers being dragged from the sand. No one escaped the ludus. No one even tried. Their bodies were remade as well as their minds. Trainers fed them a strange, heavy diet of barley, beans, and ash and wine. It thickened their flesh, hiding veins beneath soft fat so shallow cuts would not kill them quickly. The crowd thought it was strength. It was armor of meat. They were called horderia, barley men. They were livestock sculpted for slaughter. but blood has its own kind of faith. Slowly, the broken men began to crave the roar of the crowd. They watched their brothers die beneath the sun and saw how Rome worshipped them for it. Some cracked into silence. Others rose like demons, sharpening themselves on hatred. The ludus became a forge, and the product was spectacle. Champions earned luxuries that mocked emperors, perfumed baths, silk sheets, noble-born lovers who begged to be chosen. Merchants sold figurines of their faces. Drunks toasted their names. Women carved their initials on bathhouse walls and wore their blood in lockets. They were slaves, but they were adored, worshipped, immortal for as long as they kept killing. Trainers taught them to die as well as kill, a clean thrust to the throat, a final kneel in the sand, eyes raised to the stands, life pouring out like wine, descere more, to die with grace. A gladiator who begged was forgotten. One who died beautifully lived forever. And so death became theater. They raised their swords to the crowd before striking, howled to the gods, slammed their shields like drums. The stands shook with thunder. Rome believed it was watching heroism. It was watching choreography. The ludus masters crafted rivalries like playwrights. Brothers were forced to face brothers, lovers to face lovers, because tragedy made the blood shine brighter. When a champion died, priests scraped his blood from the sand and burned incense as if he were a god. Children marked their foreheads with it. Secret shrines rose in alleys. Masks of dead fighters hung like saints. People prayed to them for courage and vengeance. Even the living gladiators began to bow before stepping on the sand, whispering to ghosts. They said, if you stood alone in the courtyard at night, you could hear the dead still training, still refusing to rest. The arena had become a living thing, a mouth that swallowed men and remembered them, and it demanded more. Rome was eager to feed it. The day the Colosseum opened, Rome stopped breathing. Over 50,000 people crammed inside the marble monster, the sun blazing on its white stone teeth. Emperor Titus had promised 100 straight days of blood. He delivered. Trumpets howled. The arena floor split open, and cages rose from the underworld. Lions, leopards, bears, all starved, all furious. They tore through chained prisoners as the crowd screamed approval. Men were hunted like deer, shot down with gilded arrows, while noble women laughed and wagered. Then came the gladiators. Armored like living statues, they strode into the sand beneath curtains of dust. The noise was indescribable. Drums, screams, the stampede of sandals on stone. Pairs clashed in choreographed storms of steel, shields shattering, blood fountaining. When one fell, he raised a trembling finger. The emperor would decide with a twist of his wrist, mercy or death. Most chose death. The crowd craved it. Each kill sent a wave through the Colosseum like thunder-cracking marble. By noon, the sand had turned black with blood. But the games only grew stranger. The arena flooded, transformed into a miniature sea, and mock naval battles raged across it. Warships ramming each other while archers fired flaming arrows from the stands. Prisoners drowned under collapsing decks as spectators hurled roses. By dusk, the air stank of smoke, wine, and corpses. Titus smiled as he watched Rome fall to madness. The Colosseum had become more than a building. It was a god. It fed on fear, awe, and blood. And Rome was already addicted. But gods cannot bleed forever. Decades passed. Champions rose and fell. The crowd still roared, but something had changed. Rome was crumbling. Plague gnawed its streets, gold ran dry, legions rebelled, and yet the games continued even as the empire starved. Gladiators became ghosts of what they were, half-trained slaves thrown into the arena to die quickly, to keep the illusion alive. The old honor vanished. Crowds jeered when deaths were too fast, bored by slaughter. The magic was rotting. In the 4th century, Emperor Honorius finally ended it. No more blood, no more games. The arena doors slammed shut, and silence drowned the roar. The Colosseum became a grave. Grass split its stones. Owls nested where emperors once sat. The people whispered that the ghosts of fallen gladiators walked the tunnels at night, still fighting shadows, still begging the crowd to remember them. Rome had built immortality from bones and then abandoned it. The empire fell soon after. Some say it began the day the Colosseum went silent, because without the spectacle, without the illusion of invincibility, Rome saw what it had become, an empire of ashes. And as the centuries swallowed its ruins, only echoes remained. The clash of steel, the roar of 50,000, and the whisper of ghosts who once believed dying beautifully would make them gods.